Before we begin discussing various techniques for working on our photos, let's first talk about what makes a compelling photograph in the first place, and what we can do in terms of composition to make this a reality. And one of the essential tools that we should use is something called the rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds is simply a grid of lines that's superimposed over our image that we use for guidance. It can help with just basic things like keeping our horizon lines straight or keeping our vertical lines going up and down, but it can also help in pinpointing where our areas of focus ought to be and where our points of interest ought to be. So we're going to take a look at some example photos of how we use this, and hopefully this will help in creating really some interesting and strong imagery. Start with this shot of some hikers in Iceland, and we're going to see how we can use the rule of thirds to create a better composition here. This is a full frame shot of the image, and you can see we've got this hiker in the lower left-hand corner who is partially in the frame. Doesn't really add anything to it. We need to get rid of it. And also, it just seems like the whole image can be tightened up a bit to look better. So first, let's see the rule of thirds grid. So if we go up to View, go to Show, go to Grid, we can see it comes up. We can also do it by hitting Command apostrophe, and that'll make it appear and disappear as well. If we want to change the colors of the grid, we can go into Preferences in Photoshop and hit Guides, Grids, and Slices, and here you see the grid, and we've got a magenta with a solid line. We can change that to any color if we wanted to, and also use a dotted line if we wanted. To make it a rule of thirds, it's entered as 33.3% for a grid line, so it shows 1/3. If we change that number, we'll get more lines, and it really won't achieve the same goal that we're trying to do here. So anyway, so we've got the grid here, but we're going to look at what happens when we try to crop it. So if I hit the cropping tool, again, we're in Photoshop here, and as soon as we start moving the cropping tool, we get the rule of thirds coming live. But the problem is we've got our other grid that's still showing, so let's get rid of that because it's getting a little confusing. So I'm going to get rid of that, go back to the cropping tool, we hit it, and so now we're going to move it over, get rid of that hiker on the left-hand side. And now you can see, so we've got our 9 rectangles here, and now we've got our hikers, which really are the main point of the image, up in the upper left-hand corner, up in that quadrant. And that's kind of where you want the point of interest. You want the point of interest in these outside corners, and that leads to a much more interesting photo. We can also, in Photoshop and the other programs, we can also change our aspect ratio. So if we want to keep it, let's say, to a 4:5 or an 8:10 image, here it's a vertical, but we can go horizontal. Now it'll maintain those proportions so that we know it's going to work when we try to do an 8:10 photo or print to a different size that's in the same proportions. So here we can fool around with it, move it around, and again, you can see that we can, it's a great tool because now we've got the hikers up in the left-hand corner. We've got this line here, which is sort of a strong diagonal, which also helps as well in terms of composition. So let's click on this, and you can see, I'll just point it out here, this line here and this one here, these are all strong diagonals leading to our main focus, which are the hikers up around here. So it's a really handy tool, and it really can help in creating a strong composition that'll really work for us. Let's take a look at another photo. This is obviously a water shot of the Great South Bay in New York, with a very tilted horizon line and a lot of stuff in the foreground that we probably don't want. So we're going to crop this to make it into a better image as well and try to straighten it out. So let's go back to our cropping tool in Photoshop. If you're in Lightroom, it's going to be similar, or Snapseed. So we got the cropping tool live here. We start to move it. We see our rule of thirds. So I'm going to bring the horizon line up to about the bottom third of the photo. And let's constrain the proportions. Up here, we're going to go, I don't know, we can go 5 by 7. So here's a 5 by 7 format. And so when we move it, it's going to maintain those proportions. So we're roughly at the 1/3 point, but our horizon line is really pretty whacked out. So in Photoshop, we have something called straighten. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to click on one side of the horizon of the waterline, hold down, and then just drag across, just following along the waterline there, and then release. And now it automatically straightens. So now I've got my horizon line straightened out, but now let's figure out the rest of our cropping. So if I go back and make it larger, it just seems like there's a lot of stuff here that we don't need, especially in the foreground. So let's tighten it up. The kayaks and the surfboard here, we'll keep that in and try not to crop those out. We've got the horizon line at about the 1/3 mark, which is ideally where we want it. I got rid of the distracting items on the sand in the foreground. You still have a little bit of this tree on the right side, which is nice, and the same with the tree on the left-hand side. So let's double-click on that, and there we got it. And certainly looks a lot better. It's all straight, and things aren't falling off the frame, and we've got a nice image here. So here we've got the same image that we just did in Photoshop, and I just brought it into Lightroom, and we'll show how you can do the same thing. And even if you use Snapseed or even an Instagram app or whatever, the process is pretty much the same thing. So we're going to go to the Develop menu, hit on the Crop tool here, and you can see we got the same thing as before. We have a tilting horizon line, and we're looking at the entire photo as we had before it was cropped. So let's first deal with the horizon line just like we did before. So here in Lightroom, you can use the angle tool, and as soon as you hit on that, a grid comes up to use for alignment. So we can use the angle and align the horizon line with the grid, and you can see it's about a minus 1.17 degrees or so. And then we can go into the crop tool and do the same thing as we did before. We lined up horizon line with the 1/3 line, again eliminating a lot of the distracting foreground and a lot of the stuff on the side, which really didn't add a whole lot to the photo. So now we've got pretty much the same thing as what we had before in Photoshop, and we'll double click on this, and there we go. And we've got the same thing. So we eliminate, so now we have the boats, the kayaks leading to the boats, and we're all set. This is an image from Zion National Park taken a few years ago, and just as is, it's a fairly nice composition. And thinking about diagonals, there's a lot going on here that can work. So looking at this, the brightest area of the picture is this lower right-hand corner, and we've got some big rocks that help lead your eye from the foreground into the midground or center ground here. So here I'm going to circle the rocks here, and then the rocks kind of lead you in on a diagonal, the same with the rushing water. So we have the couple as our point of interest, but then as the secondary point of interest, your eye naturally goes up here because this is the brightest area of the frame and with the most contrast. So your eyes naturally going to go here. And as a distracting element, we have another bright area here, which we will probably want to try to get rid of. Now the other thing to think about is your colors. We've got the bluish gray on the left-hand side here, which is a very pretty color, but it's kind of subdued when you compare it to the right side where we have the green and the red, which are opposite colors. So this is a pretty strong colorway, which would make sense not to fight against, but to use it. So let's bring up our cropping tool, and we're going to set it to 5x7, which we've done before. Right now it comes in centered. You can see our rule of thirds grid. So let's keep our rocks in there in the lower part of the frame here and over here. And we can crop in, bring it in just until we've got that rock into the lower corner, because I don't want to really lose that. But the top here, we've got a lot of sky, plus we have this other bright area, which I would really like to lose because I don't think it adds anything and it just distracts the eye. So let's bring this down, the upper left-hand corner, give the peak here a little space and a little sky, but now we were able to get rid of the bright area, so that actually works pretty well. So let's double click on that, and you can see, so now the couple is a little bit off center. This peak is definitely off center, so it's nice. So we've got, again, the strong diagonals, we got our points of interest, which are asymmetrical, so it's a good, strong image. Now another option we could do, let's go back to the original and bring up the cropping tool again. You could go and make this into a vertical, even though we had a horizontal. So here I clicked on the vertical. I just switched my 5s and 7s so that the 5 is on the width and 7 is on the height. And so now it's centered, but now we've got our bright area here, which again I'd like to lose, and try to make it into a strong composition again. And I've got the large rocks here in the foreground, so I'd like to, still use that. So let's tighten this up a little bit. Bring that rock right into the corner, just like we had the other one. We're almost getting rid of the bright area here, so let's bring in the upper left-hand corner to get rid of that. And by doing that, we get this peak really squarely into that upper left-hand quadrant, which is great, which is really what you want. So now we've got that peak in the left-hand quadrant at the top and this rock at the bottom right-hand quadrant. So the opposites are kind of balancing each other. We've got the people here right at the 1/3 line. So it really makes for a really nice composition. And even this line of the water line is almost at your 1/3 point. If we bring up our rule of thirds, you can see where that comes in. So this works very, very well too. So think about that in your photos, that even though maybe you took something as a vertical or as a horizontal, if you've got enough resolution in relation to the size of the print you want to make, it can work. This is a typical problem that most of us have run into, where we take a photo of a person or a group of people, and the camera sees the bright background and exposes for that, leading to the people being kind of dark and in the shadow. So we'll get into this later on, how to adjust the exposure after you've taken the photo. And if we do that, here's an example of what happens afterwards, where we've brightened up the faces. But we still have a lot of background that can be kind of distracting, because the main focus, obviously, are the people, the image. So let's go into our crop tool again, and we can talk about eliminating a lot of the background, because you really don't want it, other than having kind of a sense of place. So even though this image started off as a horizontal, we could go into a portrait format and it would work better. We eliminate a lot of the background and it still shows a sense of place. We could go like that, and that's definitely an improvement, and we have a lot more focus on the main characters in the photo. We could go another way. Let's try a different crop, and we could try a horizontal. Again, trying to keep some of the background just so we have a sense of where they are. And we don't want that big red thing. So we could go something like this. We don't even need the feet so much. Again, we're going to see the water, so we'll know that's kind of where they are. We don't want to see, a distracting element in the photo. So let's get rid of that. And again, it's a stronger image that focuses on the main event. So be conscious of what is the main point of the photo and what you really want to show. And get rid of everything that's distracting or that doesn't add to it. Or even worse yet, get rid of all the things that detract from the main image.